March 19, 1918. The Somme Valley, northern France. Dawn breaks gray and cold over a landscape already dead, trees reduced to charcoal splinters, earth churned into a porridge of mud and bone. In the pre-dawn darkness, German artillery captain Ernst Weber stands in a concrete bunker 7 miles behind the front lines, pocket watch in hand, waiting. Around him, the muffled sounds of men breathing, the creak of leather, the metallic click of breech mechanisms being tested one final time. At precisely 4:40 a.m., Weber closes the watch, nods to his gun crews, and the world explodes. Operation Michael, Kaiser Wilhelm's last great gamble. For 5 hours, over 6,000 German guns pour steel and fire onto British positions. The earth itself seems to scream. Within days, German stormtroopers advance 40 miles, the deepest penetration on the Western Front since 1914. But Weber feels something gnawing at the back of his mind. His battery's 150mm howitzers have just expended their maximum range, 9 miles. Beyond that invisible line, British supply depots sit safely out of reach, already reorganizing, already preparing the counterattack. Weber knows what his superiors do not yet admit: Germany's artillery, the most sophisticated in Europe, has just fired everything it has. And it is not enough. This is the story of how America built a gun that made German artillerymen weep, a weapon so powerful, it could strike from 25 miles away, and change the course of the war forever. March 19, 1918. The Somme Valley, northern France. Dawn breaks gray and cold over a landscape already dead, trees reduced to charcoal splinters, earth churned into a porridge of mud and bone. In the pre-dawn darkness, German artillery captain Ernst Weber stands in a concrete bunker 7 miles behind the front lines, pocket watch in hand, waiting. Around him, the muffled sounds of men breathing, the creak of leather, the metallic click of breech mechanisms being tested one final time. The air smells of cordite and damp stone. At precisely 4:40 a.m., Weber closes the watch, nods to his gun crews, and the world explodes. Operation Michael, Kaiser Wilhelm's last great gamble. 76 divisions, over 1 million men, supported by the largest artillery barrage in human history to that point. For 5 hours, over 6,000 German guns, howitzers, mortars, and the pride of Krupp engineering, pour steel and fire onto British positions. The earth itself seems to scream. Weber's battery commander later writes in his diary that the noise was, as if God had torn open the sky. Within days, German stormtroopers punched through British lines, advancing 40 miles, the deepest penetration on the Western Front since 1914. In Berlin, champagne corks pop. Victory, so long denied, seems finally within reach. But Ernst Weber, standing amid the smoke and thunder of his own guns, feels something gnawing at the back of his mind. His battery's 150mm howitzers, formidable weapons, capable of hurling a 90-pound shell nearly 9 miles, have just expended their maximum range. Beyond that invisible line in the sky, the world is untouchable. British rail depots, ammunition dumps, headquarters, all sit safely beyond his reach, already reorganizing, already preparing the counterattack. Weber knows what his superiors do not yet admit: Germany's artillery, the most sophisticated in Europe, has just fired everything it has. And it is not enough. Across the Atlantic, another man stands in a different kind of foundry. Charles Schwab, president of Bethlehem Steel, walks through the cavernous halls of his Pennsylvania plant, where blast furnaces glow like captured suns. The telegram from Washington arrived 3 days ago. The United States Army, in France for less than a year, has discovered a humiliating deficiency: it possesses not a single piece of long-range artillery. American doughboys are fighting with French 75s and British 9.2-inch howitzers, excellent weapons but borrowed ones. The American Expeditionary Force, for all its industrial might, cannot reach beyond 10 miles. The Germans, entrenched and calculating, have built their supply infrastructure just outside that radius, untouchable, mocking. Schwab reads the specifications again. The U.S. Navy Bureau of Ordnance wants a gun, not a howitzer, not a mortar, but a gun, firing on a flat trajectory, that can throw a 14-inch, 1,400-pound shell 25 miles. Not 20, not 22, 25. The margin of safety, the margin of dominance. It must be mobile, railroad-mounted, capable of being transported to wherever the front demands. And it must be ready not in years, but in months. Schwab crushes the telegram in his fist, not in frustration but in something closer to exhilaration. This is the kind of impossible demand that built America. To understand the desperation of that moment, and the revolution it birthed, one must first grasp how thoroughly artillery defined the Great War, and how catastrophically America had neglected it. In 1914, when Europe ignited, the U.S. Army ranked 17th in the world in size, smaller than Portugal's, and its artillery inventory was a museum of obsolescence. The standard field gun was a 3-inch piece dating from 1902, adequate for chasing Pancho Villa across the Mexican desert but laughably inadequate for modern European warfare. American military planners, insulated by 2 oceans and a doctrine of coastal defense, had simply never imagined the kind of war now consuming Europe, a war where survival depended on throwing more steel farther and faster than the enemy. By 1917, when America declared war, the artillery gap was not merely embarrassing, it was existential. The French 75mm gun, the famous Soixante-Quinze, could fire 15 rounds per minute out to 6 miles, a marvel of engineering that had defined the battlefield since 1897. The German 150mm howitzer, the Schwerfeldhaubitze, could loft a shell over hills and trenches to strike targets 9 miles distant. But the new war demanded something else, the ability to reach deep behind enemy lines, to disrupt logistics, to destroy railheads and ammunition dumps before they could feed the front. For this, Europe had begun building railway guns, enormous cannons mounted on rail cars, capable of ranges previously unimaginable. Germany led this race. The Krupp Works, that sprawling cathedral of steel in Essen, had by 1918 produced the Lang Max, a 380mm monster firing a 1,700-pound shell nearly 80 miles. It was Lang Max's smaller cousin, the Paris gun, that in March 1918 began shelling the French capital from 68 miles away, each shell arcing so high it grazed the stratosphere. Parisians, drinking coffee in Montmartre cafés, would hear a distant whistle, then the crash of masonry. The psychological impact was incalculable. If Germany could strike Paris from beyond the horizon, what city was safe? The United States had nothing comparable, not even close. When General John J. Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, surveyed his artillery park in the spring of 1918, he found a force entirely dependent on Allied largesse, French guns, British shells, Italian fuses. American industry, for all its celebrated capacity, had failed to produce a single modern artillery piece in meaningful numbers. The reasons were myriad: bureaucratic inertia, a civilian economy unprepared for military production, a lack of experienced ordnance engineers. But the result was unambiguous. The American soldier, doughboy rifle in hand, marched to war essentially unarmed in the dimension that mattered most. Into this crisis stepped the United States Navy. Ironically, it was the sailors, not the soldiers, who understood big guns. The Navy had been building battleships for 2 decades, each one bristling with 12-inch and 14-inch rifles capable of hurling shells over 20 miles. These were not howitzers lobbing projectiles in a high arc, these were flat trajectory guns, precision instruments designed to strike enemy dreadnoughts on the horizon. In early 1918, Rear Admiral Ralph Earl, chief of the Bureau of Ordnance, proposed a radical solution: take naval guns, mount them on railway cars, and send them to France. The army, desperate, agreed. The specifications were daunting. The gun must fire a 14-inch shell, standard naval ordnance, but modified for land warfare. It must achieve a range of at least 25 miles, sufficient to outrange any German artillery then in service. It must be mobile, capable of being transported by rail to any sector of the front, and it must be capable of rapid emplacement and withdrawal. Most critically, it must be built fast. The German spring offensive was already underway. Every week of delay meant more ground lost, more casualties, more advantage ceded to an enemy that had been perfecting its artillery doctrine for 4 years. Bethlehem Steel, already the backbone of American naval construction, took the contract. Charles Schwab, a man whose career had been built on delivering the impossible on schedule, personally oversaw the project. The Bethlehem plant in Pennsylvania, covering over 1,000 acres, was already working triple shifts producing armor plate and ship hulls. Now, an entire section was cleared, machine tools recalibrated, metallurgists and gunsmiths pulled from other projects. The design borrowed from the Navy's 14-inch Mark IV gun, a proven weapon aboard battleships, but the railway carriage was entirely new, a massive steel skeleton capable of absorbing the titanic recoil forces and distributing them across 12 axles. The engineering challenges were staggering. A 14-inch naval gun, when fired, generates recoil energy equivalent to a freight train hitting a wall at 60 miles per hour. On a battleship, This energy is absorbed by hydraulic buffers and the sheer mass of the vessel, tens of thousands of tons of steel floating in water. On a railway car, engineers had to design a carriage that could absorb that shock without derailing, without cracking the gun mount, without fracturing the rails beneath. The solution involved massive hydraulic recoil cylinders, spring buffers, and a firing platform that extended laterally from the railcar, distributing force across a wider footprint. The entire assembly weighed nearly 500,000 pounds, 250 tons, and required a specially reinforced track to support it. But weight and recoil were only the beginning. Range, true, extended range, demanded precision in ways that naval gunnery did not. At sea, a battleship fires at a target perhaps 10 to 15 miles distant, and minor variations in shell trajectory are acceptable. The target is moving, the firing platform is moving, and hits are measured in probabilities. On land, firing at a railroad junction or ammunition dump 25 miles away, precision becomes critical. A deviation of just 1 degree translates to a miss of over 2,000 feet at that distance. To achieve accuracy, Bethlehem's engineers had to account for barrel droop, wind drift, air density, even the rotation of the earth. Each shell was individually machined, each powder charge precisely measured. The gun itself was rifled with exquisite care, 72 grooves spiraling the length of the barrel, each one cut to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. By June 1918, the first prototype was ready. Designated the 14-inch M1920 railway gun, though it would see service long before 1920, it was transported to the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for testing. On a warm afternoon, with Army and Navy observers gathered, the gun fired its first live round. The sound was described by one witness as the voice of Thor, a bass roar that rattled windows in Baltimore, 30 miles away. The shell, weighing 1,400 pounds, climbed into the sky, tracing a parabola so high that observers lost sight of it. 45 seconds later, it struck a hillside 23 miles distant, creating a crater 40 feet wide and 15 feet deep. The observers, many of them veterans of European service who had seen German railway guns in action, stood silent. America had just entered the race. But one gun was not enough. Schwab's factories went into overdrive. By August, 5 guns were completed. By September, 7. Each one was shipped in sections to the port of Philadelphia, loaded onto transport ships, and conveyed across the submarine-infested Atlantic to France. In the port of Brest, American engineers reassembled the guns, mounted them on specially built rail cars, and began the slow journey to the front. By October 1918, the first American 14-inch railway guns were in position near the Meuse-Argonne, aimed east. German intelligence, meticulous and thorough, had been tracking American artillery development with interest and skepticism. In late 1917, intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations revealed American plans for long-range guns, but German analysts dismissed them as bluster. The Americans, they noted, had no tradition of heavy ordnance, no Krupp equivalent, no proven doctrine. Even if such guns were built, the logistical challenge of transporting and emplacing them in the chaos of the Western Front seemed insurmountable. As late as September 1918, German field reports confidently stated that American artillery posed no threat beyond 12 kilometers, 7.5 miles. Then came the morning of October 6, 1918. Near the village of Thiaucourt, a German supply depot sat in a quiet valley 14 miles behind the front lines, well beyond the range of any Allied gun. It was a hub of activity, trains arriving with shells and rations, trucks departing for forward positions, soldiers eating breakfast in the autumn sun. At 7:42 a.m., without warning, the depot ceased to exist. A shell weighing 1,400 pounds struck the center of the rail yard, detonating with a force that leveled every structure within 300 yards. The explosion was felt in villages 5 miles away. Before the smoke cleared, a second shell arrived, then a third. In the span of 10 minutes, 14 rounds obliterated the depot, killed over 200 men, and destroyed enough ammunition to supply a division for a week. The surviving Germans, dazed and bloodied, could not comprehend what had happened. No Allied gun could reach this far. The sound of the firing, normally a warning, had been inaudible, the guns too distant. It was as if the shells had materialized from the sky itself, conjured by some invisible hand. In the hours that followed, as German officers pieced together reports, a grim realization set in: the Americans had built something new, something that changed the equation. In the German artillery command, the reaction was not defiance but exhaustion. Captain Ernst Weber, reassigned after the failure of the spring offensive, read the intelligence summaries with a sense of inevitability. For 4 years, Germany had held the technological edge in artillery, longer ranges, better fuses, superior tactics. Now, in the war's final months, that edge was gone. The Americans, late to the war, had leapfrogged German development not through incremental improvement but through brute industrial force. They had taken a naval gun, a weapon designed for ship-to-ship combat, and turned it into a land weapon of unprecedented reach. It was, Weber wrote in his diary, the logic of American abundance made manifest. The symbolic weight of the 14-inch gun extended far beyond its physical destruction. To German soldiers, already exhausted by 4 years of war, already watching their supply lines fray and their rations dwindle, the arrival of these American guns represented something more terrifying than high explosives, the industrial will of a nation that had not yet fully mobilized. If America could build these guns in months, what else could it build? How many divisions could it raise? How many tons of shells could it produce? The German High Command, reading the same reports, understood that the war was no longer winnable. The spring offensive had failed. The Allies were resupplied. And now, American artillery could strike with impunity from distances that made counterfire impossible. The psychological impact on German gunners was particularly acute. These were men who had spent the war as the aristocrats of the battlefield, artillerymen, the kings of modern warfare, the ones who shaped the battle from afar, untouchable. Now, they found themselves targets. American 14-inch shells began targeting German artillery positions specifically, using aerial reconnaissance and sound ranging to pinpoint locations. A German battery would fire a barrage, and within minutes, American shells would rain down, not from the expected direction of the front but from some invisible point far behind Allied lines. One German artillery officer, captured in late October, told his American interrogators that his men had begun referring to the American guns as Gottesstimme, the voice of God, because they struck from beyond sight, beyond retaliation, with a judgment that seemed divine. But the true measure of the 14-inch gun's impact was not merely the physical destruction it wrought, nor even the psychological terror it inspired. It was the transformation it represented, a shift in the balance of industrial power that would define the remainder of the war and the century beyond. In 1917, America had been an artillery pauper, dependent on France and Britain for even basic field guns. By late 1918, it was fielding weapons that outranged and outmatched anything Germany could produce. This was not a matter of superior German engineering being bested, it was a demonstration of a different kind of power altogether, the power of a fully industrialized economy, unravaged by war, capable of focusing its entire productive capacity on a single problem and solving it with ruthless efficiency. The story of the 14-inch railway gun is, in microcosm, the story of how America won the First World War and set the template for the conflicts to come. It is a story of industrial capacity, yes, but also of a kind of flexibility and innovation that older military establishments struggled to match. The U.S. Navy Bureau of Ordnance did not spend years developing a purpose-built land artillery piece through committees and prototypes. It took an existing naval gun, adapted it, and shipped it to France within months. Bethlehem Steel did not plead for time or resources. It cleared factory floors, retrained workers, and delivered. This was a new way of making war, faster, more adaptive, and sustained by an economic engine that Europe, for all its military tradition, could no longer rival. Consider the symbolism embedded in the gun itself. 14 inches, the caliber of American naval dominance, the guns that had turned the U.S. Navy into a global power. 25 miles, a range that spoke not of defensive perimeters but of offensive reach, the ability to project power deep into enemy territory. Mounted on rails, mobility, the refusal to be pinned down, the logic of a continental nation accustomed to thinking in terms of vast distances and rapid movement. Every aspect of the 14-inch gun embodied American strategic culture, technologically audacious, industrially confident, and utterly pragmatic. The shells themselves were artifacts of abundance. Each one weighed 1,400 pounds, forged from high-grade steel and packed with TNT, resources that Germany, by 1918, was struggling to procure. German munitions factories, starved of raw materials by the British blockade, were producing shells with increasingly diluted explosives, sometimes filling them with concrete or even sawdust to maintain weight. American shells, by contrast, arrived in France by the tens of thousands, each one a full-power round. German prisoners, captured near ammunition dumps hit by American fire, spoke with awe of the American wastefulness, the casual expenditure of shells that Germany could no longer afford to match. One captured officer, asked about the American artillery, replied simply, "You have more of everything." But abundance alone does not win wars, it must be directed by will. The decision to build the 14-inch railway guns was made at the highest levels of American command, driven by men who understood that industrial capacity was meaningless without the audacity to deploy it. Charles Schwab, for all his reputation as a steel magnate, was also a man who believed in American exceptionalism, not as an abstract ideal but as a measurable output. When the Army and Navy came to him with an impossible demand, he did not negotiate, he delivered. This was the American creed in steel, that the impossible was merely the not yet accomplished, that deadlines were targets to be met, that the word "no" was an invitation to prove otherwise. The guns reached their peak deployment in the final weeks of the war. By November 1918, 10 14-inch railway guns were operational in France, positioned along the American sector from the Argonne to the Vosges. They fired over 1,000 rounds in the war's final month, targeting German railheads, supply depots, and troop concentrations. The range and accuracy were such that German forces began pulling their logistics infrastructure back beyond 30 kilometers, nearly 20 miles, creating a supply crisis that contributed to the collapse of the front. German soldiers at the front, already demoralized by hunger and dwindling ammunition, now faced delays in reinforcement and resupply that turned tactical retreats into routes. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the guns fell silent. The armistice had been signed. In the eerie quiet that followed, American gunners stood by their weapons, exhausted and oddly bereft. The 14-inch guns, which had been in action for barely 6 weeks, had fired their last shots in anger. But their impact lingered. In the weeks following the armistice, German officers, surrendering their positions and their records, were given tours of Allied artillery parks. When they saw the American 14-inch guns for the first time, massive, immaculate, still gleaming with factory oil, many reacted with visible emotion. One German major, a career artilleryman, stood before the gun in silence, then asked through a translator how many America had built. When told 10, with more in production, he reportedly wept. The weeping of that German major was not merely personal grief, it was the recognition of a historical shift. For a generation, German artillery had been the gold standard, the model that other nations emulated. Krupp steel, German precision, Prussian discipline, these had been the pillars of military superiority. Now, a nation that 4 years earlier had possessed virtually no modern artillery had built guns that made German achievements obsolete. The major's tears were the tears of an old order confronting the new, of craftsmanship bowing before mass production, of Europe acknowledging that the future of warfare would be written not in the academies of Berlin or Paris but in the factories of Pennsylvania and Detroit. The 14-inch railway gun remained in American service long after the armistice. During the interwar years, the guns were maintained and updated, their barrels relined, their carriages modernized. When World War II erupted, they were brought out of storage and deployed again, this time not in France but in coastal defense roles, guarding American harbors against a naval threat that never materialized. Their very existence, however, served a purpose, a reminder to potential adversaries that American industry, once mobilized, could produce weapons of unmatched power and range. The guns were finally scrapped in the 1950s, cut apart and melted down, their steel recycled into the infrastructure of the Cold War. But the legacy of the 14-inch gun endures in ways both tangible and intangible. Tangibly, it established the template for American artillery development in the decades that followed, an emphasis on range, mobility, and overwhelming firepower, sustained by an industrial base capable of rapid innovation. The lessons learned in building the 14-inch gun informed the development of the M1 240mm howitzer in World War II, the atomic cannon of the 1950s, and even the cruise missiles of the modern era. Each represented the same underlying philosophy, that American forces should possess the means to strike deep into enemy territory, to disrupt logistics and command, to make the enemy's rear areas as dangerous as the front lines. Intangibly, the 14-inch gun became part of the American mythos of the Great War, a symbol of Yankee ingenuity and industrial might triumphing over old-world militarism. In the decades after the war, the story of the gun was told and retold in memoirs, histories, and even pulp magazines, each iteration emphasizing the speed of development, the audacity of the design, the shock of German forces encountering it. The narrative was seductive because it was true. America had entered the war late, ill-prepared, and within 18 months had produced a weapon that changed the battlefield. It was a story that fit neatly into the national self-image, a confirmation that American exceptionalism was not mere propaganda but demonstrable fact. Yet the story of the 14-inch gun also contains a darker undercurrent, one less often acknowledged. The gun's development was made possible by an industrial infrastructure built on the labor of millions, steelworkers, miners, machinists, many of whom toiled in dangerous conditions for wages barely adequate to sustain their families. Bethlehem Steel, for all its patriotic fervor, was also a corporation driven by profit, and the contracts for military production were lucrative. The rapid development of the gun was not solely a product of national will but also of a system that could mobilize labor and capital with ruthless efficiency, a system that would later be criticized for its inequities and its human costs. The 14-inch gun, then, is not merely a symbol of American power but also a reminder of the industrial order that sustained it, an order built as much on exploitation as on innovation. In the quiet fields of northern France, where the guns once roared, there are today no monuments to the 14-inch railway gun. The battlefields have been reclaimed by farmers, the trenches filled in, the craters smoothed over. In small museums, you can find shell casings, fuse caps, fragments of steel rusting slowly in display cases. But the guns themselves are gone, dismantled and forgotten. Only in archives, in faded photographs, in yellowed technical manuals, in the diaries of men long dead, does the 14-inch gun still speak. And yet, if you know where to listen, you can still hear its voice. It echoes in the sound of every American artillery barrage since, in the thunder of 8-inch howitzers in World War II, in the roar of rocket artillery in Korea and Vietnam, in the precision strikes of GPS-guided munitions in Iraq and Afghanistan. It is the sound of a nation that learned, in the crucible of the First World War, that industrial power and military power are inseparable, that the ability to produce abundance is also the ability to project force, that the factory floor and the battlefield are linked by an unbreakable chain. The German artillerymen who wept before the American guns in 1918 understood this in a way that transcended military doctrine or national pride. They wept because they recognized that the war they knew, the war of incremental advantages, of craftsmanship and careful planning, of limited resources husbanded with care, was over. The future belonged to nations that could build faster, produce more, and deploy with ruthless speed. The future belonged to the 14-inch gun and the industrial colossus that created it. In the end, the story of the 14-inch railway gun is not merely a story of engineering or tactics. It is a story of transformation, of how a nation that had been a military afterthought became, in the span of months, a power capable of reshaping the battlefield. It is a story of how abundance, channeled by will, becomes dominance. And it is a story of how war, that most ancient and unchanging of human endeavors, was revolutionized by the factory, the furnace, and the assembly line. When Ernst Weber returned to Germany after the armistice, he did not return to artillery. He opened a small engineering firm in Munich, designing industrial machinery, and he never spoke publicly about the war. But in a letter to a friend, discovered after his death, he wrote, "We thought we had perfected the art of artillery. We thought our guns were the finest in the world. Then we saw what the Americans built, and we realized we had been children playing with toys. They did not perfect the art, they industrialized it. And in that industrialization, they found a power we could never match." The 14-inch gun sits now in memory, a ghost of steel and thunder, a reminder that wars are not won by the bravest or the most skilled alone, but by those who can bring to bear the most overwhelming force, sustained over time, delivered with precision and without mercy. The Germans wept not because they were weak, but because they faced an opponent whose strength was not in tradition or discipline, but in the cold, relentless logic of production, the logic that built America, that won the war, and that would shape the century to come. And in the silence that followed the guns, in the peace that descended over Europe in November 1918, one truth became inescapable: the age of the craftsman warrior was over. The age of the industrial power had begun. And America, with its 14-inch guns firing 25 miles into the heartland of its enemies, had announced its arrival not with a whisper, but with a roar that shook the earth.